Hey gang, it's Joy. We are back with Unit 2 of AP African American Studies. This is Freedom, Enslavement, and Resistance, and it is the biggest chunk of the exam. This is the 2A portion. We're going to get straight into it with a subject from the last unit. We remember from Unit 1 that there were African people living in Europe way before the transatlantic slave trade started. You saw elites visiting for diplomatic reasons and non-elites becoming European domestic laborers, boatmen, guards, entertainers, knights, and the like. These people would have been considered Atlantic Creoles. That means those of Atlantic descent who'd understood both African and European customs, whose linguistic skills meant that they could work all sorts of jobs. These people mostly gained their power before the widespread existence of chattel slavery. We call Atlantic Creoles within Spain and Portugal Ladinos. Those are Afro-descendant people who became Hispanicized over time, who are familiar with Spanish and Portuguese language, culture, and customs. Some Ladinos were sold over from West Africa to Spain and Portugal as enslaved people, and some came freely on their own. When Spanish people started exploring the Americas in the early 16th century, Ladino people were present on their voyages. They'd travel from the Iberian Peninsula or Cape Verde, all the way over to the Americas and help Spanish colonization efforts. They'd take over modern-day Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida over here, which they called La Florida at the time. In the 15th to 16th centuries, Africans in the Americas were taking on mostly three jobs. Number one, as conquistadors who were doing conquest. Number two, as enslaved laborers who were doing mines or agriculture. And number three, your free skilled workers and artisans who already understood specialized trades like blacksmithing or carpentry and would be taken on for their skills. So Afro-descendant Ladinos were on the ships of Ponce de Leon, Hernan Cortez, and tons of other explorers that you've definitely learned about in a freshman world history class, becoming the first people of African descent to enter the Americas. There are two examples that College Board wants you to know. The first one is Juan Garrido, who's a conquistador. He's born in the Kingdom of Congo, but he's going to move to Lisbon, Portugal as a free man. He is going to explore modern-day Florida as part of a Spanish expedition in 1513. And that makes him the first known African to ever enter in North America. He's serving in the Spanish military. He's doing the work of colonialism. He's conquering indigenous people and taking their land. You can see this picture right here. Next, we're going on to Estebanico, or Esteban, as he's also known. He is an African healer from Morocco. He's enslaved by the Portuguese, sold to the Spanish, and with the Spanish, he goes on a voyage where he's forced to work in Texas as an explorer and a translator. Eventually, though, he's going to be killed by native peoples in their fight against Spanish colonialism. You can see that neither of these people are exactly participating in systems of chattel slavery. And that's because it's only around the 17th century that we really start to see what's called the social construction of race. So we gotta get something straight here. Race is not a biological thing. A 16th century Anglo-Saxon Protestant would have never looked at an Irish Catholic and said, like, hey bro, at least we're both white, right? The labels of black and white were invented following the rise of slavery to try and make human trafficking in labor camps seem normal. It's only when this idea starts to gain traction in the 17th century that's normalized and written into the law in various ways. Some of us are familiar with the 1662 Virginia law, that is the one-drop rule, saying if you have even one African ancestor, the law will count you as fully black. Another way that people try to make slavery seem like it has its roots in biology is partus sequitur ventrum, which is Latin for offspring follows the womb. This is another way of putting the definition of race into law. It says that a child's legal status, that is determined by the status of their mother. Basically, what this does is clarify if enslaved women are raped, their children will still not be free. Slavery is in the Constitution too. The Constitution kind of dances around the subject. Articles 1 and I think 4 of the United States Constitution talk about it, but they've removed the words slave and slavery from all of their earlier drafts. But it lays out some of the compromises that you've heard of before. Think of the 3/5 compromise, which calls African Americans 3/5 of human beings for representation purposes in government. You have slave non-importation, which forbade Congress from banning the slave trade until 1808. You have the Fugitive Slave Clause, which says that enslaved people are property that must be returned to their rightful owners. If I was personally studying for this unit, I wouldn't focus on these three clauses. I would focus more on remembering Partus, Dred Scott, and slave codes, though. Well, speaking of that, another way that slavery was formalized in law was Dred Scott's freedom suit. This was a Supreme Court decision where Dred Scott and his wife sued for his freedom. The decision from the court was that African Americans, enslaved, free, anything, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. Obviously, probably the worst case that the Supreme Court of the United States has ever decided. This is going to be later overturned, but this is going to set a huge precedent for just denying the rights of any African American people in the United States. The other major way that race became formalized was on a more local level, and it was slave codes. South Carolina develops a really strict one in response to the Stono Rebellion, which we're going to talk about later, but these are laws that were created to restrict the rights of Black people. They're defining chattel slavery as something that's race-based, something inheritable, and something that is going to be a lifelong condition. But before we got to 1808, before we got to many of these laws, there was the transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade lasted over 350 years. That's going to be from around the early 16th century to the mid-19th century. See the dates on here. It took more than 12.5 million enslaved Africans just to the Americas, with huge death tolls. Out of these, around 5% of the survivors, which is around 388,000 people, came directly from Africa to what is now the United States. That meant there were more Africans in the Americas than Europeans, Asians, or any other ancestral group. Africans outnumbered every single person just due to the sheer size of the transatlantic slave trade. So, enslaved Africans transported directly to mainland America primarily came from the 9 contemporary African regions. Of these, I try to remember Senegambia and Angola as being the biggest hubs. Together, they supplied around 50% of the entire slave trade. As we know, West Central Africa, that is, are the largest suppliers of the slave trade all across the transatlantic slave trade, with ethnic groups like the Wolof, Akan, Igbo, Yoruba. You can also remember from last unit that nearly half of those who arrived in the United States came from Muslim or Christian regions of Africa. Your major intermediates in this system are going to be Portugal, Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Those are your top 5 enslaving countries. And they're going to bring them, in the case of the United States, often to Charleston, South Carolina. That's the biggest U.S. slave trading hub. 48% of those brought to the United States are going to land here at some point. If you look at this impact outside of the United States, unsurprisingly, this is genuinely terrible for the West African societies that most enslaved people were exported from. Remember Congo from Unit 1, which became so economically and militarily reliant on Portugal that it was physically unable to stop the slave trade, where nobles were literally kidnapping other people to sell to the Portuguese. Like in Congo, local leaders would be forced across the slave trade to partake in the slave trade for a threat of greater violence. Number 2, we see the slave trade exacerbates violence between neighboring societies, wars between kingdoms, and capturing of other people. Think suddenly your entire kingdoms, that is government and economy, can focus on nothing but warfare and human trafficking for years and years and years. It's also just, number 3, a huge population loss. Remember, 12.5 million people are captured. Those are people who would otherwise be leaders, soldiers, keepers of tradition, keepers of the family. All these people are going to be taken to other continents and forced to do manual labor. These things combined are going to massively destabilize governments all over Africa and have huge future consequences. For the captives themselves, there are 3 parts to the journey they would take. Here, we're not talking about the triangular trade, which is the path that European merchants and slave traders would take. I'm talking about the journey of captives themselves across the Atlantic Ocean. This first part, this green, is sometimes called the First Passage. It's where Africans were taken from interior states, meaning they had to be marched for miles and miles from where they were over to the Atlantic coast where they would be exported. On the coast, many would have to wait in dungeons, obviously unsanitary, horrible conditions, until ships would arrive to collect them. Your average American history class probably emphasized the second part the most, which was the Middle Passage. This is the actual journey across the Atlantic Ocean, and it's going to be roughly 3 months. Aboard slave ships, there's humiliation, beatings, torture, rape, malnourishment. Around 15% of captive Africans are going to die during this part of the journey. The final passage is where those who made it to ports in the Americas would be quarantined, resold, and taken to whatever location they would be forced to labor in. This is the quote-unquote final passage. It could often take as long as the first and middle passages combined. So what you see right here is part of the middle passage, right? It's a diagram of a slave ship. What this diagram doesn't include, and what other diagrams of slave ships from the era don't include, are images of guns, weapons, nets to prevent captives from jumping overboard, and iron instruments to force feed those who resisted. Even the diagrams that you see, just like these, only include ships at around 50% of their maximum capacity. Or even after we see what maximum capacity is, then merchants would often overload these ships for the purpose of increasing their profit margins. Unsurprisingly, you're going to see huge resistance. These things right up here. You see hunger strikes, you see jumping overboard, you see revolts. These are going to have some minor successes in that they're going to make the slave trade less profitable, and they're going to be more dangerous to traders, which is going to disincentivize slave traders and merchants. But it will also come at a cost. It'll lead to the development of even more brutal ships with those, again, guns, weapons, nets, and iron instruments. I want to give one example, though, of a successful revolt. This is Segbe Pie, also known as Joseph Singh. This is a Mende captive from Sierra Leone. In 1839, he is going to lead a group of enslaved Africans to revolt. So they're taking over this ship known as the La Amistad. He is going to sue under the basis that he has been unjustly kidnapped from his home. And after 2 years of trial, the revolters are finally granted their freedom by the Supreme Court of the United States and sent home. This has the effect of generating a little bit of sympathy from the general public as well. When we move on, 2.5, we're now going on to post-transatlantic slave trade stuff, right? 1808 is when the U.S. government formally bans the transatlantic slave trade. This sounds super great. Brazil, for reference, it banned the slave trade until 1850. Turns out, this is not great for two main reasons. One, the slave trade kept going via the black market. There was still the importation of enslaved people illegally. This is especially because there were other events going on when the ban was enacted, like the Napoleonic Wars, which stopped the U.S. government from interfering and doing things like stopping the trade from actually happening. It's going to decrease the slave trade, which is a net positive, but you have issue number 2, which is the main one. The United States didn't want to end slavery with this ban. They just wanted their kind of slavery to be self-sufficient. By 1808, they knew that they would have enough imported people to force enslaved people to procreate to meet their plantation demand. To give an example of how bad this domestic slave trade was, even when it wasn't transatlantic, we called this the Second Middle Passage. In the first half of the 19th century, there was the cotton boom, which is literally what it sounds like. It's a dramatic increase in demand for cotton after the invention of the cotton gin and demand from British and American textile mills. The northern industrial states want to benefit from this slave economy. You are going to see the largest forced migration in all of American history, relocating enslaved people from the upper South inland states like Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Missouri to the lower South cotton-dependent states like South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. You have over 1 million people being displaced, which, to put the practice of slave breeding into context, is 2.5 times the amount of people who faced the original Middle Passage. So, let's go in. What were enslaved people actually doing? How was slavery working? First up, this was institutional, even if this isn't written on the slide. Enslaved people could be owned by individual people, which we might often be taught in elementary school, but they could also be enslaved by whole institutions. Think your church, a factory, even a college. No matter whether you were enslaved by a person or an institution, you would generally be split into categories. You had your domestic and your agricultural laborers, and then you had your quote-unquote skilled laborers. So skilled laborers are people with pre-existing skills that they had performed in Africa or picked up in Africa. So examples, blacksmithing, basket weaving, crop cultivation. You have a bunch of other examples on here. They could be further trained as painters, carpenters, tailors, healers, and those skills were exploited by enslavers for cash, or even used as things reasons to sell or things that would increase the value of an enslaved person. Those within the domestic or agricultural sphere would often specialize in one or the other, but could still have to change roles at the whim of the enslaver. Those in these domestic roles would be doing some work inside the home, like cleaning, cooking, laundry, or childcare. In agriculture, people would work in either the gang system or the task system. The gang system is your cotton, your sugar, your tobacco. These are people who are going to have to work in groups from sunup till sundown with heavy supervision under the watch of an overseer. This is going to be much harsher than the task system, although both of them are obviously forced labor, are incredibly harsh, right? Work is only going to stop when the overseer decides that enough work is done. Completely arbitrary. You are going to see the development of some culture, though. Some are going to, although they're going to lose many linguistic practices, are not going to be able to speak their native languages, are going to develop things like English work songs and spirituals due to constantly being supervised and having to speak in English. Well, when we turn over to the task system, this is for labor-intensive crops that require specialized knowledge. So often people are coming over from Africa with the understanding of how to do things like cultivate rice. That's where we get the term rice coast from. So when we're thinking of rice and indigo, you have people who are, because they have such specialized knowledge already, potentially working more individually, under individual quotas, having slightly less supervision. Because of this less supervision, people are able to keep their linguistic practices slightly more. Think like the Gola Creole language is going to develop in the Carolina Low Country. So as we move on, we have to get one other thing clear. Free states were not blameless, and they were not safe havens for enslaved people. These quote-unquote free states depended on the cotton and cash crops of the South to keep their industry going. The entire American economy was built off of the backs of enslaved people. But more than the economic part, these places actively legislated against African Americans, right? Free states would make laws trying to prevent entry of Black people into their state. They would try to prevent the advancement of Black people and try to prevent the opportunities or limit the opportunities that were available to them. They would try to keep free Black men from voting, with the example of New York. Ohio, for example, stopped Black men from testifying against white people in court. In fact, if we move on with this voting point, before the ratification of the 15th Amendment, that's 1870, only 2 states, Wisconsin and Iowa, had actually given Black men the right to vote. Even if we call this a quote-unquote free state, you can see that we're not trying to make Black people and white people equal. And these states are by no stretch trying to give Black people equal rights at all. So, since we've cleared up now that these free states weren't actually as free, we can see African Americans did flee to other spaces as well. Remember, there were other powers in North America too, like the Spanish. You have St. Augustine, which is the oldest continuously occupied European established settlement in the United States. It was founded in Florida, 1565, by Spanish conquistadors and free and enslaved Africans. St. Augustine was owned by the Spanish, who you can see up here said that enslaved people who converted to Catholicism could work and purchase their own freedom. This was also a deliberate move by the Spanish. It was something strategic, not just because they believed human rights were human rights, because having more runaway enslaved people from other empires would destabilize their enemies. But it did have positive effects for some enslaved people, right? You see many runaways were escaping to St. Augustine by the 17th century. One person who sought sanctuary in Spanish Florida, we're going to talk about too, was Francisco Menendez. He was an enslaved Senegambian. He fought alongside native people and against the English in the Yamasee War. He went on to lead Fort Mose, which is an area just north of St. Augustine, which was a sanctioned free Black town established by the governor of Spanish Florida at the time. Another person who got sanctuary and benefited from it was Jemmy, an enslaved man from the region of Angola who led nearly 100 enslaved African Americans in a march towards Spanish Florida. They set fire to plantations along the way. This was the Stono Rebellion. Most American history classes will cover this. This is something that I would make sure to drill into my head. Many of these enslaved people who were participating in the Stono Rebellion were from the Kingdom of Congo, which is again around that present-day region of Angola, and they were Portuguese speakers who were familiar with Catholicism. In response to the Stono Rebellion, though, the British province of South Carolina is going to pass a restrictive slave code in 1740. 1 month later, British colonial forces are going to invade Florida, eventually seizing and destroying Fort Mose. Let's take a look at, with that South Carolina slave codes in general more deeply. We've already said that they defined chattel slavery as race-based, inheritable, lifelong condition, as well as providing other restrictions on what enslaved people could do. They even did things that seemed stupid, like restricting the ability to wear fine fabrics. They're really meant to dehumanize people in the most literal sense of the word. It's literally a code saying how to take away human rights. So this would also result in enslaving societies, the development of them throughout the Americas, including the Code Noir in Código Negro in French and Spanish societies, respectively. So with the example of South Carolina's 1740 slave code, it classified all Black people as enslaved. There is no such thing, according to the slave code, as a free Black person in South Carolina. Interestingly, it also defines all members of indigenous communities that resisted the colonial government as non-subjects and thus enslaved. It punished all these things that you can see on screen: gathering, drumming, learning to read, rebelling, running away, traveling abroad, traveling to other colonial territories. Self-defense when attacked by a white man was punishable by death. You also have African American freedom seekers. Besides going to places like St. Augustine, you're going to have people who escape into remote areas, forming their own independent communities. Those people were known as Maroons. One group of Maroons who joined the Seminoles in Florida fought along the Seminoles during the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842, in which they resisted relocation from the United States federal government. The status of African Americans did vary from tribe to tribe, though. The quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes called out by the United States government had members of the elite who enslaved African Americans. When enslavers were relocated during the Trail of Tears, they took enslaved people with them, and they adopted slave codes, formed slave patrols, and recaptured Black people who fled for freedom. This made Black indigenous kinship weaker and would deeply hurt mixed race members of indigenous communities as well. When we go on, this is a really example-heavy portion. I think that this portion would be really good to know for something like an FRQ. I would memorize a couple examples and be able to throw those in whenever I need it. So let's look at English. Let's look at language in general, right? Because people are forced to speak English, you get the development of some new literature. You have things like poetry. Think of Phyllis Wheatley's poems on arriving to America. You also have the new development of a genre, what's called the slave narrative. So think Solomon Northup, who is someone who is mentioned in the course exam document. I would kind of vaguely know about him. You have Frederick Douglass, who is obviously the incredibly famous one. You have people who are going to write about slavery, write about what it is like, and then also bring some enlightenment to the fact that slavery was not a benign, it was not a kind institution. It was something obviously brutal and dehumanizing, right? Then beyond English, we just talked about the Gola Creole language that developed in the Carolina Low Country. You have new developments, especially among those who had done long-distance trade before and were used to using lingua francas or common languages to communicate. You again have storytelling being incredibly important, which is going to happen through things like music as well. Or think of, the griot tradition of places in West and West Central Africa. Let's go on to music. So you have attempts to recreate songs of West Africa with improvised instruments, think drums, banjos, rattles that are made from gourds. You also have what's going to become the foundation for gospel music. So you take Christian hymns and Christian elements and combine those with elements like call and response, clapping, improvisation, syncopation, things that are taken from West and West Central African music, and that's going to form this new genre. We also go on, right? When Senegambians and West Central Africans are arriving in Louisiana, they have this thing called a fode, which is a recurring musical phrase. It's basically the same thing as a refrain in music. And that refrain is going to be the backbone behind American blues, a new genre that's going to develop. Last one is one that's actually really important. I would note this one specifically if you don't know any others. These are spirituals. They're also called sorrow songs and jubilee songs for reasons that are pretty self-explanatory. They're going to articulate hardships and hopes. They're going to be storytelling. If we're looking at influences, we're again going to see like biblical themes like redemption, deliverance from the Christians. We're also going to see rhythms and performance styles from West Africa. And finally, we're uniquely speaking to contemporary American experiences. We're really forming a new culture here from this group of obviously enslaved people. When we look at the purpose, we want to resist dehumanization, tell stories, express creativity, but we also sometimes see hidden meanings hidden inside these spirituals, like running away via the Underground Railroad, right? If we go into visual art, this image is shown in the course exam document, also with the second one. We see that a lot of the time visual art made by enslaved people is going to be objects with function. That's kind of one of the only practice that's available to them. You have things like pottery, storage jars, quilt making, bed covers. What I would know with pottery, you can see I've accidentally switched the names here. But there is a man named David Drake, or Dave the Potter, who is going to hide, or not even hide, but inscribe poems on side of jars, which is going to be something that's unprecedented due to obviously him having literacy, and then also be able to flaunt that literacy by putting it in a place that's easily accessible to many. So we're on the last slide. This is our last stretch. We're remembering that labels of blackness and whiteness were pretty much made up. But Black culture, or African American culture, is very real. All those aspects of Black culture that we just talked about developed in response to the realities of systemic racism that people identified as Black faced at the time. So now we're talking about the question of naming. We've seen this exact slide, this exact image of a slave auction before. 1808 was the date that the United States banned the international slave trade. But after 1808, you start to have kids and grandkids of enslaved Africans who have no connection to Africa at all. They have more of a connection to this distinct culture that's forming in the Americas with new forms of music, visual art, even languages. That's when you start to see ethnonyms like Afro-American, African-American, and Black come around. After the ban of the international slave trade, and this is what's going to really precipitate this, we see the American Colonization Society. That's a group of white Americans who say, we don't want slavery in the United States because we don't want non-white people here at all. We're going to try to send every Afro-descendant person in the United States to a colony in Africa instead. Obviously, you see a lot of enslaved people who aren't trying to be shipped to a place in Africa that white Americans colonized. And that's going to cause even more African Americans to start accepting these new ethnonyms, to start embracing the fact that they are also American, they are also a part of this new culture, instead of just someone to be sent back to a place. Okay, up on the board, I have got 2 free response questions. These are pulled directly with the parts that I think are most relevant to this 2A section from the previous years, 2024 and 2025. Guys, if you want to send your responses into the comment section, if you want to send your good responses, your bad responses, if you want to write one about brain rot and skippity toilet, I'll grade them. Otherwise, I think these are good for practice. I will try to put as many resources or study guides as I can in the description or a pinned comment. I'll try and make any corrections. You guys are going to do great on your tests. You can get through this. Stay educated, stay informed. I am going to pass out.